So I'm not a lawyer. I don't study corporate law. I've learned a lot in the last hour and a half, and so thank you for that. I'm a social psychologist by background, and I run a research unit based in the Monash Sustainable Development Institute called BehaviourWorks Australia. I think we're interested in the same thing, though. Our mission is to use behavioural science to try and encourage better outcomes for society in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I think my presentation today will largely reflect some examples and stories of projects we've been involved in where we have been able to influence, positively influence outcomes that are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly those that relate to corporations. I would start by saying a piece of work we did a while ago examined decision-making by political leaders. We had about 20 people in the room, including former lead heads of state and some senior executives out of government departments and private sector. And we tried to understand decision-making. And one of the key things we found was that those decision-makers, they make decisions based on their assessments of what their constituents want and feel. Very common for politicians to use stereotypes to make decisions, to say, well, that's my constituent, that's how they would react, so that's why I make a decision. And I think that's probably true of corporations as well. So I'm going to start with the story of a project we did a long time ago. In fact, we're only kind of peripherally involved, but this is in the city of Townsville, which is in the northern part of Australia. There was a program there to try and encourage households to increase energy efficiency in their homes or decrease energy consumption. And we took a behavioural approach and we were able to identify that one of the most important things that a household can do, and there are 240 things roughly, and trust me, we measured every one of them, for a household can do to decrease the energy in their home, was to paint their roof white. I think the Greeks know this, right? So anyone from that country. So this is an aerial picture after the program was run, and we see on the right-hand side here existing housing stock where almost a lot of the houses have either been painted white, the roof, or a light colour. So for all intents and purposes, a really good success story around how behaviour change can be used to get good outcomes. But what's kind of most interesting here and perhaps relevant to this conference is the left-hand side of this picture. So the left-hand side of this picture is an overview of a new development. And all the roofs in that new development are white. The reason for that is because the volume builder or the corporation that was building those houses knew about the White Roofs campaign that was happening and made the decision that it was a fairly simple decision that they should install white roofs on new houses. Efficiency gains are enormous, by the way, up to 70% energy efficiency gains with a white roof on a house in a tropical climate. So what this was interesting was to say, well, actually corporations notice and they pay attention to, and where decisions can be made, it might be a really nice, if it's a nice thing to do, and will certainly help save a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So this idea that we could influence corporations from an individual behaviour or attitude perspective became quite interesting to us, and it led us to some other projects. And this next one I'll talk about was done in conjunction with a zoo. And zoos don't sound like a particularly great, or sound like perhaps an odd sort of organisation to deal with, but they have a lot of visitors who are in a state of mind while they're there that is conducive to behaviour change, actually. And so we ran a campaign to try and get people to buy MSC seafood products. So most of you know about the Marine Stewardship Council seafood products. It's an eco label. It's globally recognised. And so there's the logo there, and there was a whole campaign, and so the zoo, which is in Sydney, said to every visitor that attended the seal show, you should go and buy MSC tuna or MSC products, particularly MSC tuna from your supermarket. At the time, the two major supermarket retailers in Australia were not stocking MSC. And within a week of this campaign running, one of them was and had donated $1 million to the campaign for its advocacy, and the second one followed about 2 weeks after that. Again, it showed us that the consumer and how we demand, the things that consumers do can influence how corporations act. But I think the real goal of all of this is actually policy support. So while it's nice that we have these examples that sort of led to get immediate outcomes, actually what we want is, based on the work we've done around political decision making, we want decision makers to feel comfortable that their jurisdictions are okay and their constituents are okay, and in fact supportive of decisions to be made. If we think about some of there are examples in Australia in particular, when we've had drought, where increased regulations led to increases in public opinion polls and about politicians. Rarely happens, right, where new laws come in and popularity goes up. But when the market is correctly sensitised and is okay with that, and in fact supportive of it, it becomes a lot easier. So I wanted to talk about a campaign that was run in workplace safety. We were involved in this probably 15 years ago. Those of you in Australia may know about this campaign. It was this little boy was waiting for his parents to come home anxiously, and more and more time passed, didn't come home, and the worry increased, and eventually the parent did come home, and there was relief. The campaign actually ramped up a lot more than that over time, and to the point where police went knocking on the door, basically to tell a spouse that their husband had died at work, although it's only implied, it's not direct. And the campaign had the tagline, "The most important reason for safety at work is not at work at all." Very powerful, had Dido music playing in the background, and it was very emotional. And I think what this did was really, in the language of the creator of that campaign and our long-standing partner, was it sensitised the market. It said change needs to come because workplace safety is not, lack of workplace safety is not acceptable. And so what that campaign enabled was a whole raft of tools to happen that otherwise would have been difficult. So there were new environmental structuring that came in place. There was new financial incentives that were enabled, and so they rewarded people that had safe workplaces, that fined people that didn't have safe workplaces. There was a whole raft of tools that were all implemented, including tougher regulation and legislation, which were accepted because the most important for safety at work is not at work at all. So we can sensitise communities to try and to be supportive of policy. And I think they're sometimes overlooked. As a social psychologist, we're really interested in, people only really do three things: think, feel, and act. And two of them I think are particularly interesting, is this relationship between our behaviour and our attitudes, and the relevance of this will come up shortly. But they both influence each other. So how we act influences how we feel about something, and how we feel about something influences how we act. I think a lot of the things we see in public domain, and particularly government action, probably corporate action as well, assume attitudes drive behaviour. They do, yes, but the other way around as well. And there's some great studies for those of you who are interested in social psych, where if I give you $1 and you put it in a homeless person's hat, you'll care more about homeless people because of that, even if I gave you the $1. And so it can influence both ways, and particularly when we see feedback. The reason I'm mentioning this as a case study is because if we can develop and strengthen attitudes, then we can certainly move from attitudes are essentially whether we think something's good or bad. We might be able to get more policy support. Policy support is attitude, really. This is a great story that Robert Cialdini, the social psychologist, tells of Korean prisoners of war. These are people who were Americans who were caught in the Korean War, and they were subjected to what can only be called manipulation in every sense of the word, where they were encouraged to accept and put their name to and publicly advocate for things to do with communism. They didn't do it in a they did it in a sneaky way, but not in a way that was against the will of the individuals who were caught. Often they would get them to say things like, communism isn't all bad. There are some positive aspects to communism. And the ability of, and probably most of us would agree with that, right? So there are some positives. And then they got them to sign their name to it and then air that publicly. And then they advanced that agenda over time to the point where people, prisoners of war, when they left Korea, didn't want to leave. And they were free to go, didn't want to go, and in fact became advocates for a regime they detested, in fact went to war against. Behavioural science can manipulate people. Those prisoners of war were watching their own behaviour, observing who they were, and forming opinions about themselves and their identity based on that. Another example, which is perhaps most relevant here, is a piece of work done by a guy called John Ferguson, a Danish academic, psychologist, around policy acceptance. He looked at the acceptance of policy and its correlation with environmental behaviour. And what he found was, not surprisingly, that those people that do more environmental behaviours at home support more policy, and in this case was policy for wind farms. Makes sense. Those that do more, those that care about wind farms, typically do more, therefore they're more supportive of policy. But what he also did was control the attitude. In other words, same people, same attitude towards environment. Two people cared equally about environment, but some were acting more and some were acting less. And those that acted were much more supportive of wind farm policy than those that didn't. In other words, we observe our own behaviour, and through that observation, we determine who we are and our attitudes towards things. So I think there are a number of ways to take this forward. I think that's my last slide. I think that so human behaviour and the attitudes of citizens is valuable. We have seen it valuable in political decision making. I sat in a room of 20 of them, and all of them to a T said, "I need that support to be able to make these decisions." And there are ways we can bring people on board. And I think the solution, particularly when attitudes are strong and particularly when they're negative, so perhaps some of the Republican politicians from the previous speaker, can be changed through behaviour. You see it in politicians actually who get assigned portfolios that are outside of their usual area of interest. They tend to change who they are and form policies that are more supportive. So thank you. Hopefully behavioural science has a space in your world too. I've been fascinated to hear about the law. Thank you.